Hello, everybody, and welcome to Unit 3. This week, we're going to learn about the duration of copyright protection as well as who owns the copyright of a work. Determining who the copyright owner of a work is sometimes confusing, as many of the students in this class are technical communicators, designers, or visual developers. The concept of work for hire will play a huge role in determining whether or not they own the work that they create. Additionally, ownership rights can be sold in a myriad of ways. For example, an author can sell just serial rights for North America, which means they are giving up the right for a magazine or other serial publication to exclusively publish the work in North America. Or they can sell electronic rights or one-time rights or exclusive rights. Remember, it's the original creator of a piece who has the right to transfer ownership. Recall the bundle of rights that are contained in copyright, and one of them is the ability to transfer. The length of time for which a copyright owner has exclusive rights to transfer or make use of or profit from their work is known as copyright duration, and there are some variables to determining the expiration date. The copyright term calculator is helpful in determining this, and that's linked in one of the readings. Another thing that's really important is the Copyright Act of 1976. It set the copyright term for the life of the author plus 50 years, or 75 years for a corporate authored piece. However, several parties, as you will read this week, successfully lobbied Congress to extend this term, and with the Copyright Term Extension Right, which was also called the Sonny Bono Act or the Mickey Mouse Protection Act, copyright is extended to the life of the author plus 70 years. Corporate authorship was extended to 120 years after the piece's creation or 95 years after the publication, whichever is earlier. This effectively prevented many works from entering the public domain, and in fact, it moved works that were already in the public domain out of it retroactively. The copyright on many of these works is set to expire in 2019, and many predict that lobbyists will once again make their way onto the scene to once again get copyright extended. This week, you're going to learn about many of the proponents and opponents' arguments for extension. So let's get started. Before you continue viewing this lecture, it would be very helpful for you to review Circular 9 because it'll give you a much better idea, and then come back and continue the lecture. Did you do what I said? Did you look at the circular? I hope you did. So let's talk about it. Circular 9, which is Works for Hire, attempts to clarify what Section 101 of Title 17 of the U.S. Code says. Okay, there are two different ways that a creation could be termed work for hire. Okay, and they're both described in the circular. If either of these two conditions are met, the item is considered work for hire. Okay, so if something is work for hire, one of the following must be true, either number 1 or number 2. Let's look further. So let's look at number 1 in more detail. A work prepared by an employee within the scope of his or her employment. So copyright in this case is always owned by the person or the company commissioning the item to be made. So what does this look like? An employer tells, which another word for that is commissions, his employee to do the work and write the report on XYZ, okay? The employee never owns copyright for the work, okay? The work, however, must be within what would be reasonably considered the scope of his employment. So if Maria is an account executive and creates a presentation on last year's sales figures, that is within the scope of her duties, and therefore the company would own copyright because it is work for hire. It's part of her regular job. However, if Maria is part of the cleaning staff and creates the report, it's not within the scope of her employment. Therefore, she owns copyright. Okay, and that's something that we need to look at a little more carefully as we look at some of these scenarios. So let's move on to way number 2. Okay, the work has to be specially ordered or commissioned, and in one of the categories below, and the parties have to expressly agree in a written instrument that the work is going to be considered work for hire. Let's take a look closer. So let's pretend that ABC Company needs a new logo drawn. Okay, they don't have a graphic designer because they're so small. Miss In Charge, get it? She's in charge, so that's why I'm calling her Miss In Charge. Decides that she needs to find a graphic designer to create this logo. So she goes to one of the many find a freelancer sites, such as Upwork, okay, to find a graphic designer. She finds one, looks at his portfolio, and decides that she likes what he does. So she emails the graphic designer, and we're calling him Freddie the freelancer, and she tells him what she needs. Okay. Freddie isn't a regular employee. He's been hired to do this one task. He's an independent contractor. That means he gets to control when and where he does the work. Miss In Charge can't tell him, for example, he can only create the logo between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. He pays his own employment taxes, such as Social Security and payroll tax. Okay? Whether or not someone has independent contractor status is a really important concern here when you're dealing with freelance workers. You might want to look at the reading this week on what classifies someone as an independent contractor if this is something of your interest. Okay, so let's keep continuing, okay? So the work has to be in one of the 9 types listed, but actually it's pretty easy to classify works in these categories. We would just say the logo was considered to be a contribution to a collective work. So Freddie creates 6 different designs that Miss In Charge can pick from. Who owns the copyright to those designs? Well, let's look again at the criteria for something to be work for hire. Remember, there's 2 ways that something can be work for hire. The first is that the work was prepared for an employer within the normal scope of the employee's duties. Okay? Is that true in this case? No, because we have already said that Freddie is not an employee. He was specially hired for this one job. So let's look at the second way, number 2. The second is that the item is specially commissioned work. It's from one of the 9 categories listed, and there is a written agreement expressly transferring copyright and naming it as work for hire. Okay. For option number 2, both of those subconditions must be true in order for it to be work for hire under that condition. So let's go back to Miss In Charge and Freddie. To qualify as a work for hire under number 1, Miss In Charge would have to tell her employee, a graphic designer, to create a logo. But we know Freddie isn't an employee. He doesn't regularly work for this company. He is just completing this one task. Okay, so it doesn't qualify as work for hire under number 1. So let's look at number 2. For something to be considered work for hire under condition number 2, these 2 factors must both be true. So, was the item specially ordered? Was it in one of the 9 categories? And is there a written agreement expressly stating that the work is work for hire or the copyright is being transferred? Do we know that? Not in this case. So, if there is no written agreement explicitly transferring ownership to ABC Company, then Freddie, freelancer, is the owner of the copyright, even though Miss In Charge may have paid him to create the logo. If there is a written agreement explicitly transferring ownership to ABC Company, then Freddie Freelancer is no longer the owner of the copyright. He has transferred his ownership rights to the ABC Company. The written contract transferring ownership rights is the key element here. It must be written and explicitly state that the ownership is being transferred or that the item is being considered work for hire. Suppose, instead, that the written agreement said this: I will agree to create a logo for ABC Company by the date using the specs and parameters given to me, and ABC is going to pay me $200. Okay? Freddie has not agreed to transfer his ownership rights in this written agreement. Therefore, he still owns copyright of the logos. This is why companies who hire freelancers are very cautious about getting explicit explicit transfer of ownership rights in writing. So let's go back and review. There are two ways something can be considered work for hire, either number one or number two. For number one, the work has to be prepared by an employee in the normal scope of his duties. That's all that has to be happening for that case to be work for hire. Okay. Number two, several things have to happen. It needs to be specially commissioned, be in one of those 9 categories, and there must be a written agreement between the parties transferring ownership. Okay. However, in Circular 9, there's a confusing paragraph that I'd like to try to clarify. Okay. Here it says if a work is made for hire, the employer or other person for whom the work was prepared is the initial owner of the copyright, unless both parties involved have signed a written agreement to the contrary. Just think about that. Okay. The employer is always the initial owner. Okay, so let's look at this. Okay, so if the work was done by an employee, okay, it's always going to be work for hire. The minute it's created, the employer is going to own the copyright. Okay, unless of course the employer agrees otherwise, which is not going to happen in corporate America. Okay. In the case of a person commissioned to create something in those 9 categories, their work is only called work for hire if there is a contract transferring ownership and deeming the work to be work for hire. When there is a contract, the person creating the work never owned the copyright. Remember, copyright rights begin the moment an item is created in a fixed form, written down, drawn, whatever. Since the item was created under contract, the item was created under work for hire conditions, and thus the creator, the writer, never owned the copyright. Okay, I know this is confusing, so let's go over this a couple more ways. Okay, so in the case of an employee, okay, a contract is needed to transfer the rights back to the employee. Yeah, that's the only way that an employee is going to be able to own the rights. Okay. In number 2, the contract is needed to transfer the rights to the employer or person specially commissioning the work. And just watch this for a second. Okay. So, if something is prepared by an employee, the employer owns the copyright. If for some reason the company is giving the rights back to the employee, a contract is needed to transfer them back. Okay. The employer is the original owner of the copyright. If it is something that has been specially commissioned or ordered, created by an independent contractor, the independent contractor is the owner of the initial copyright unless there was a written contract stating that it was work for hire and that rights were being transferred. Okay. So in one case, for the person who creates it to get the rights, they need a contract. And in the other case, case number 2, in order for the person to who created it to get the rights, there can't be a contract transferring ownership. So it's the exact opposite. I know it's confusing, and this is why the attorneys make so very much money. The Constitution didn't specify any time period for copyright or patent protection. Remember, it just said for limited times. So there were separate laws that were created from the time of the Constitution until now that have actually specified what the time period for copyright protection will be. So when you look at this, which is one of the readings, you can see that timeline and how it was increased to what it is today. It might be helpful to actually make a listing of the acts and what the specific act did in terms of the length of the term. Pay special attention to the flow chart that's on the public domain Sherpa website. It's one of the readings, and make sure you mouse over the text and the diagrams for more information. That will be really helpful. And there's also an interactive way to determine how long a copyright term is, and it's at this link in the readings. If you do not see on the left, the question is the work published and the box, you need to enable Flash to run. Generally, there's a second paragraph instead of the is the work published and the box, and somewhere in there it says something about Flash. If you click that, generally it will allow the Flash to run. There previously was an option for copyright owners to renew the term of their copyright. There were specific rules that were in place for this, but the rules were only valid in certain time periods to make things even more confusing. So to determine if the copyright needed to be renewed to get the extra term, this link in the readings is important. You're going to read about the parties that lobbied to get the Copyright Term Extension Act, which is also called the Sonny Bono Act and the Mickey Mouse Protection Act. I think that'll give you an idea on who the lobbies were for this. Copyright was extended to the life of the author plus 70 years. Corporate authorship, that means works that were created by companies, i.e. Disney, the ownership was extended to 120 years after the piece was created or 95 years after publication, whichever is earlier, okay? And this, as I said earlier, prevented many works from entering the public domain. And in fact, there were some works in the public domain that were retroactively moved out when this Copyright Term Extension Act was put into place. The copyright on many of these works is going to expire in 2019, and many predict that lobbyists will once again make their way on the scene to extend copyrights. This week you're going to read who the proponents are, who the opponents are, and you can make your own decision which is best for us in America. Please make sure to post any questions you have to Hallway Conversations. If you have a question of a personal nature, please send me an email. Happy reading.